To finish off today, we've covered a lot of ground in the last 36 hours, lots of threads, and I'm delighted to welcome Major General Paul Tedman to weave them together with the closing keynote for the conference as Head of Space Command, Commander Space Command, UK Space Command. Paul, floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's finally great to talk to you. I'm sorry I'm on last, and I was a little bit worried. I don't mind telling you, when we got to lunch, I thought I'd be talking to maybe a couple of my staff and my mother listening online. So we invited Tim in to entice you back to give that excellent presentation. So thanks very much, Tim. I thought that was really excellent. Before I talk about the task Anu set me, which is trying to string together everything that's been said over the last day and a half. And by the way, I think it's been excellent. Thank you all very much indeed for your engagement and contributions. I wanted to just put a few personal thank yous out there. The first is to all the speakers and the participants. I think they've all been excellent without exception. I'd like to thank Anu. I think General Whiting summed it up nicely. He's definitely got a career in the BBC if he wants it going forward, but his enthusiasm, his professionalism has definitely come through. So thank you, Anu, for taking us through the last few days. I'd like to thank the sponsors, which we couldn't do this without them. A particular thanks to Asper. And then slightly unusually, but I'm absolutely determined to thank them, I'd like to thank my team too. I've only been in the job about 3.5 months. So they've led this. They've walked us into this really successful conference. And there's 3 people in particular, which is Ian, Ash, and Charlie, that I'd like to call out. Could you just join me, please, in thanking them on my behalf and others? Hey, look, I'm going to keep this quite short because there's 3 reasons for that. The first is that, funnily enough, everything I wanted to say has been said, which is a good thing. The second thing is I want plenty of time for questions. So I want you to hold me to account for where you think I'm going to go and some of the things you've heard. But the third reason is that I'm a real firm believer that space people talking about space isn't particularly helpful. It becomes a bit of an echo chamber. So I hope what you've seen over the last day and a half is that we've really tried to diversify the presentations to bring to life what Tim's talked about, what many people have talked about, the national security space enterprise, not just defence. We might need to try and rename this in the future, because I think it's about that. It's about other people advocating for us from the highest levels all the way down. We know what space is and why it's important. We need to penetrate and break through into other areas of society and politics to ensure they understand that too, as we've just heard from Tim. And I saw a really powerful example of this in my last job about a year ago. I went to something called the NATO Allied Warfighter Talks in the US. And that's the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the US, with all of the combatant commanders, so all 11, including General Whiting's predecessor, all of the service chiefs, plus all the key leadership from NATO. And they discussed some really knotty issues, not least around Ukraine. But the Vice Chairman summarised those 3 days by saying, and I quote, "If you haven't realised it yet, it's all about space. Space has emerged as our most essential warfighting domain." Do you want me to go on? But that's the kind of power we need, and from other people that aren't space experts, if we're really going to penetrate this. So given Admiral Grady's assertion and what we've heard over the last couple of days, I think we now all need to ask ourselves, so what must be done? Lenin's great line there. If we're going to become competitive, the theme of this conference, a competitive space power in the next decade or so. And what do I mean by competitive? I mean credible enough to deter, postured and prepared to enable the joint force to fight and win. I'll just say that again. If we're going to be competitive, certainly from a defence perspective, I think we need to be credible enough to deter, postured and prepared to enable the joint force to fight and win. I suspect, just across the road, there's some other folk in the Ministry of Defence wrestling with that same question. What must be done? Is space important? I hope they've also been listening over the last day and a half, particularly to some of the really insightful comments. So I have to tell you, my essay is probably a bit crap, and it will need your help and your input into that SDR proposition to really make the case and break through. Before we look forwards and try and answer that question, I think it's also important that we reflect back on some of the things we've achieved. First, I think we should take comfort in the defence space strategy. It's largely fit for purpose, in my view. It's provided the North Star for the command for its first 3 years. And we've achieved a great deal. First, the command's fully established. I'll just highlight that line. Fully established. Don't need to worry about that anymore. And declared IOC. I think we've improved defences of space IQ and our own, dare I say it. So I think there's a lot more people, and you saw this really effectively delivered, I think, over the last few days, in defence who understand space now in a way they haven't previously. And my own staff have also upped their space IQ. And we have, I think, a much better understanding of what capability required and the resources we're going to need to meet defence's ambition that was laid out in the defence space strategy. I think we've also deepened allied cooperation in space through initiatives like CSPO, OOD, NATO, and other frameworks. It's great to see so many of my fellow space commanders here, and I really enjoyed the panel earlier. Shame General Whiting had to leave, but Greg and all the others that are there, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I think we've also enhanced cross-government partner efforts. So, I routinely work now with DCIP, UKSA, and all the other government agencies that bring mutual advantage to space in the UK. And I really enjoyed Paul Bates' keynote that kicked us off back on Tuesday, just to sort of start us off on that journey of the national security space enterprise. I think we've also begun to work smarter with industry, but I accept we've got a lot to do here. And so I really appreciated the candor from the industrial panel. I liked Air Marshal Sir Stu's pitch. I thought that was really good. I liked the Dragon's Den too earlier. I think I learned a lot from that. It was quite insightful, and I'll take some of that forward. And I know we've got another session shortly after this. So again, work to do, I think. I think that's work in progress. And we've got some restrictions around that preventing us from all moving forward at the pace we would wish. One for the next session. I think we've also started to integrate into joint operations. And you'll note I'm just a simple soldier. I'm not an aviator. And so I think jointry is starting to flow now through space in the UK. And he's not here, but thanks to CJO, who's a very busy man, I'm sure you're watching the news, who took the time, which I think says a lot, to come and speak to us about how space is being integrated into joint operations. And finally, on that sort of reflection, I think we've started to deliver capability to meet our ambition. The launch of Tyche in many ways, for me, marks the coming of age of UK Space Command. And it's a testament to a tireless effort by the entire defence space team and our essential industry partners. And Sir Martin, if you're here still, are you? Stick your hand up. Thank you very much indeed for your partnership on Tyche. It's much appreciated. For me, Tyche represents the end of the beginning for UK Space Command. But the world doesn't stand still, as we've heard over the last 2 days. Threats are increasing and diversifying. I don't believe I've ever served in my, let's say, 25 years. I don't want to embarrass anybody. About 25 years service, I don't think I've ever served at a more dangerous time, which I think is challenge number one as we go forward. Values-based relations giving way to power-based exchanges, as we're seeing in the Middle East and in Ukraine. We're having to deal with more assertive authoritarian states, and the domain is clearly contested. We've seen that in multiple different presentations over the last day and a half. And it's been clearly described by General Whiting by some of the threats that he outlined. So that's challenge number one, I think, increasing and diversifying threats. Challenge number two, I think, is our dependence on space is increasing. Critical national infrastructure was highlighted by Tim. Space is critical national infrastructure. 2 of the top 5 national security threats are space-related. We routinely rely on 40 satellites a day for our day-to-day business. 16%, I think Paul said. I've got 20 written down on my script here, but it's too good a quote to challenge. But a lot, 20%, let's say, of the UK economy is underpinned by space. The global space economy is on track to hit $1 trillion by 2030. And a bit closer to home for me in defence terms, space no longer just accessorises warfare, it's fundamentally changing how we do our business. And as we heard from Kaz, and I'll repeat it, this new reality for me is born from space-based kill whips that exploit technological advances in sense, decision-making and precision long-range effectors, which are going to enable, and if they're not already, dramatically faster, more precise global or domain engagements, so-called advanced engagements. denying, countering, or limiting the effects of those adversary space capabilities on our own forces, as well as capitalising on them for our own purposes, is, as we heard from CJO, critical to operational success going forward. Therefore, no prudent long-term vision for defence strategy can ignore the role of space or its role in global affairs and its relation to our national security, as we've just had highlighted by Tim, which brings us back to the so what. I think we all acknowledge everything I've said thus far. Some thoughts. First, I think in UK Space Command, we've got to evolve thinking from establishing the command, which has taken 3 years and has been a fantastic effort by the entire team, to an organisation that's now focused on delivering capability and effect to the joint force. Delivering capability and effect to the joint force. I think my tasks are simple. I am but a simple soldier, as I've said, but they're also complex. I think they're two. The first, to protect and defend our national interests in space. And I mean national interests, not just defence interests in space. And the second, to deliver space effects to the joint force and, of course, our allies. Pretty straightforward, hard to do. Second, I think we need an organising principle, a vision or ambition that gives us a headmark of where we're trying to go to. Too often in space, we dive down straight into capability. ISR, PNT, SATCOM. We don't actually understand what it is we're trying to deliver or the why. So I think that vision needs to be something like becoming a competitive space power by 2030, which is the theme of this conference. And I think it's not a bad start point. Some of you will know that we pitched to be a meaningful space power in the DSS back in 2022. I think we need to advance that now into becoming a competitive space power. What do I mean by that? I outlined it earlier, but a little bit more detail. Credible enough to deter. I think that's relatively straightforward to understand. But drawing on General Whiting's points, postured and prepared to operate through a first strike, he described it, I would say first mover counter space, and enable the joint force to fight and win. And as I mentioned in the the panel earlier, that's going to require more resilient architectures, disaggregated, dispersed, etc. So if the ends, which I think that is of a strategy, if the ends are becoming clear, we clearly need to sharpen up our ways and means. And I think this is going to include some big pitches and ambitious pitches around capability choices and priorities. So the first of those, and I've heard lots of people say, what are the priorities for UK Space Command? So here you go. The first of those, very clearly articulated by Kaz, space control. For me, the outstanding priority. Like all other domains, I talked to normalization earlier, if you can't responsibly control the domain, the force will not be able to operate in, from, and through it. It won't be able to move, communicate, and fight. And we've seen a clear manifestation of the loss of air superiority in Ukraine, which I would think would be magnified significantly if we lost space control. So for me then, it's absolutely imperative that we have space control in order to conduct joint operations. I'd confidently argue that space control is therefore a prerequisite and probably a precursor for all future multi-domain operations. Priority 1, space control. Priority 2 for me, decision advantage. I don't say SATCOM, I say what's the outcome? Decision advantage, which requires satellite communications, plus all the data relays that provide the real-time global communications, enabling the command and control that's necessary to allow a force to observe, orientate, decide, and act. Priority 2. Priority 3, global sense to enable, strike, and understand. Military and commercial space-based ISR to deliver that wide area, low latency, high fidelity, and I mean targeting quality, multispectral sensor capability. Included within that, I think there's new demands here around integrated air and missile defense and the space layer for sense, track, warn. And of course, and I know some people prioritize this, and it's absolutely right, they did, but it doesn't sit within UK Space Command at the moment. But within there, I think, is assured GNSS, PNT type capabilities. But I think that sits in somebody else's budget, somebody else's wheelhouse at the moment. If it didn't, it would be right up there in my top priorities. All of those three things need to be hung on, this is the tricky bit, a cross-domain, cross-classification, cyber-hardened network system to allow integration. And integration for me is at the heart of any defence review and probably the centre of gravity of multi-domain operations going forward. All that ambition, noting its outcomes and capability, has some vital dependencies, and we've heard a lot about those over the last day and a half. I'm not going to try and murder them on the stage here, but what I'll do is I'll talk you through what I think are some of the key things that enable those outcomes and that vision. First, unsurprisingly, the development of a national strategic approach to space that harnesses not just the military, but the political and economic potential of the UK space enterprise, which is all of us in this room. Second, sufficient people with the right knowledge, skills and experience, and we've heard skills mentioned time and time again over the last day and a half. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely got to do it. We're in the beginnings of our journey. We need to grow and we need to educate people. Third, international collaboration. Space is just too big and too expensive to go it alone. It's a team sport and we have to keep going and collaborating to maximise our efforts globally. Fourth, procurement reform. What do I think that looks like? We could go on all day about this. I think it's probably something like a space portfolio that allows me the ability to veer and haul, to exploit technology as it emerges, but also keep pace with a threat. We frankly cannot do that at the moment. It's just too clunky. There are examples, and some of them came to life on the stage, of where we've been able to do that, but that should be commonplace, not the exception. Lastly, increasing integration of commercial capabilities into what I would call a hybrid, dual-use space architecture, because I completely agree that about 80, and I'm going to be a bit 10% lower than the number I heard, about 80% of the capabilities that I need are completely dual-use. It's only that top-end capability that must be military, and therefore military-owned. The rest of it, I think, can be commercially delivered. So I said I'd keep it short. So to close, a mere 40 years after the first powered flight, Field Marshal Montgomery was sufficiently convinced of his army's dependence on the air to state publicly, if we lose the war in the air, we lose the war and we'll lose it really quickly. I think we're an equivalent inflection point for space. I genuinely mean that. If we're to become a competitive space power by 2030, we demand bold and visionary action, and the time is now to deliver that. I and we relish the challenge. I hope you join us on that journey. I look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Now, I'm not sure if Slido is still active. It's suddenly the
Right.
the Wi-Fi thing has gone on to it's not showing anymore. So if I go time-wise, we've got 7 or 8 minutes. Oh, hold on a second. Thank you, Pierre. You're going to rescue me here. Thank you very much. So I've got one on Slido, and then I can go open. So, Paul, should the military take a share in funding educational activities at the national scale to bring young people into the wider space industry?
It's like all good answers. I'll come at it with a different perspective. I think if we establish a national security space enterprise approach, we wouldn't even be asking that question. It would be a national endeavour which would cross government, and therefore everyone would be contributing to answer that question. I don't think we can specifically call out defence or DSIT. We've got to broaden our perspectives into a national perspective.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to the floor to do a sort of mix and match approach. Got 1 or 2 people who've already asked. Sir, do you mind if the microphone could come around, please? And again, if we could just have name, organisation, brief context as well, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Robert Wall. I'm a reporter with Aviation Week.
Hello, mate.
Just curious, I mean, the UK for a long time kind of avoided the missile defence debate because no one wanted the answer that, yes, it needs to be done and costs a lot of money. The question basically on active space defence, is that something you're going to do the same thing, or will you try to figure out how to find the money and so the UK plays its role, along with the others that are trying to deal with the problem?
So I think I understood that right. Are you asking about IAMD, or are you asking about...
So what I was saying is, for a long time, the UK didn't really invest heavily in IMD because it didn't want to ask the question, it didn't want the answer.
Right.
We now face the same thing in the space domain in a way, in terms of threats to space assets, as we saw. And active space defense is also an expensive answer. But clearly, a lot of people the French are investing in it. The Germans are looking at the the U.S. is doing it. What's your thinking on the UK's role in terms of active space defense?
So I think it's one of multiple different ways that you need to be able to deliver space control. And again, it goes back to my point earlier about normalization. Take a carrier strike group analogy. If you've got a critical piece of military hardware, you'll defend that through multiple different other ships, multiple different capabilities that sit in an onion around it to protect and defend it. It's no different in space, and we'll take all available capabilities to be able to protect and defend our national strategic assets.
Let's see, we've got one more question down here from the floor as well, please.
Hi there, Tim Robinson, Aerospace Magazine. On a related subject, and following Tim's presentation, when are you going to put Dragonfire lasers on a UK satellite?
I'm not going to answer that. And it kind of links to my point, and I won't be drawn on specific capabilities, but of course we'll use all strategic available capabilities to the best of their advantage.
Just looking here, going back to Slido. Yeah, we've heard a lot about good communication, trust, clear demand signals in some of the sessions, but also in your overall summary, Paul. How will you make sure that in doing so it becomes more than just encouraging rhetoric? So there's always that danger of when we've got dialogue, debate, how do we enable it but then constrain it so it retains its focus for our needs?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because everything I say is literally that. It's ambition, isn't it? I mean, we've actually physically got to deliver this stuff. I do think there's an enormous opportunity through the SDR. I think it doesn't take the brains of Lloyd George to figure out that what Kaz said and what I said is the bones of our SDR pitch going into the defence review. It's for others to decide whether that's to be taken. It's choice for them. What I would say is that even set against the defence space strategy that's already been published with capability priorities, you've heard a change in tact from us in terms of what we think is now important. And given that I've already got resources, I could easily realign those to the priorities that I've got. So I think there's a bit of reassessing the prioritization, which you've heard us do. And I then think there's a really detailed analysis then of own access, collaborate, to try and really seize opportunities across how we do capability going forward. And you heard Space Warrior was called out earlier, a brilliant example of where we got the whole ISR community in to look at what's the best way to look at space-based ISR. How much do we need to own? How much should we collaborate? How much should we access on? So I think even if we got no new money, we'd do things differently, which I think would make us more efficient, would deliver more capability. I'll just finish that answer going back to my speech about I am now absolutely focused on capability delivery and delivery of effect. We've got building, we've got badges, we've got letterheads. That's phase one. Phase two now is I've got to deliver capability. If I stand here at the end of 3 years and I haven't delivered capability to the Chief of Joint Operations, people will ask some very serious questions about what I've been up to for the last 3 years. So I'm absolutely focused on that.
Thank you. Paul, got time probably for one more question.
Right.
I've got one from Joanna Hart that's more strategic, so taking into account the operational priorities you have. Joanna Hart is head of the Space Partnership, so bringing together academia, industry and government, so DBT, DSIT, so agencies represented, I sit on the board, and also MOD. You've talked about taking a national strategic approach to space. So what do we need to do collectively to achieve this? What would you say are the next steps in creating that, beyond the operational priorities you have, that longer standing strategic framework for impact?
Well, I think I would answer this in a similar way to I did on the panel, in that I think we did have a really good strategic approach to this a few years ago. And it's not to embarrass anybody, but the Prime Minister of the day took a really big interest in space and put it on an agenda that drove real energy into the sector. That drove, dare I say it, the National Space Strategy, which drove the Defence Space Strategy, which then equated to money. So you can follow that logic through here. It's not for me as a military officer to tell the government of the day what they should be doing. But what I would welcome is the seizing of an opportunity to really push space into the forefront of a new government and and drive that leadership through the whole community to give us efficiency and coherency as we go forward.
Thank you. We're pretty much at time now, so Major General Tedman, can I thank you again for taking 2 full days out of your schedule, to your team for supporting this. Colleagues, could we please show our thanks to Commander UK Space Command.
Thanks very much, Steve. Appreciate it.